Picture a Britain that was still catching its breath. The year is 1953. Rationing had only just ended. Most families were getting by on tight budgets, and the average working man could barely dream of owning a car, let alone a machine that came with two-tone paint, genuine leather upholstery, and white-walled tires straight from the showroom floor. And yet, at the London Motor Show in the autumn of that same year, Ford of Britain unveiled exactly that car. It was called the Zodiac, not a Jaguar, not a Rover, a Ford. And it was dressed like it had somewhere important to be. Now, if you are old enough to remember these cars on British roads, and many of you watching this almost certainly are, you will know that the Zodiac was not just a vehicle, it was a statement. It was the car the bank manager drove, the car the sales director arrived in, the car your neighbor waxed on a Sunday morning while you pretended not to notice. Over nearly 2 decades in production, the Zodiac passed through 4 distinct generations and, across the entire Zephyr and Zodiac family, more than 550,000 units left the Dagenham factory, bound for buyers across Britain and beyond. That is a remarkable number for a flagship executive saloon, in an era when most British families considered a Ford Anglia the height of automotive ambition. So, why does barely anyone talk about it today? Why, when people mention the great British cars of the post-war era, does the Zodiac so rarely get a mention? That is what we are here to explore. Buckle up, because this is a story worth telling properly. Section 1. The car that rewrote the rules. The Mark I, 1953 to 1956. To understand the Zodiac, you have to understand just how radical its underpinnings were because they predated the Zodiac itself by several years. The story really begins in 1950, when Ford of Britain unveiled the Consul and Zephyr at the Earl's Court Motor Show. These were genuinely modern machines. They featured an all-new overhead valve engine design and, crucially, they were the first mass-produced British cars to use the MacPherson strut, independent front suspension, the same basic principle that engineers around the world still use today. Ford of Britain had beaten everyone else to it. That was not a small thing. But the Zodiac, launched at the London Motor Show in the autumn of 1953 and on sale from 1954, took that already impressive platform and dressed it in a manner that had no precedent at the Ford badge. It came, as standard, with two-tone paintwork, full leather upholstery, a heater and demister, a windscreen washer, white-wall tires, fog lamps, spot and reversing lamps, a clock, wing mirrors, and a cigarette lighter. Strangely, the radio remained an optional extra, which tells you something about the priorities of the era. Under the bonnet sat the same 2 to 1,000, 2 to 162 cubic centimeter straight 6 as the Zephyr, but with an important difference. Where the Zephyr ran a 6.8 to 1 compression ratio producing 68 horsepower, the Zodiac's engine was tuned to a 7.5 to 1 ratio, raising output to 71 brake horsepower. It sounds modest by modern standards, but in 1954, on British roads that were still largely shared with farm carts and pre-war machinery, it was a meaningful step up. According to a test published in The Motor in 1955, the Zodiac recorded a top speed of 80 miles per hour and could reach 60 miles per hour from a standstill in 20.2 seconds. Fuel consumption averaged 22.2 miles per imperial gallon. By the standards of a large family saloon in the mid-1950s, those were perfectly respectable figures. If you wanted more performance, the aftermarket was already catering for you. The well-known Raymond Mays offered a complete engine conversion for the 6-cylinder car's twin carburetors, an alloy head, the works. According to the Autocar, dated the 8th of November, 1957, the Raymond Mays conversion pushed performance to a top speed of 101 miles per hour and cut the 0 to 60 time to 10 seconds flat, with a standing quarter mile of 17.6 seconds. In a decade when Britain was still making do and mending, that was genuinely remarkable. There is one more event from this first generation that deserves a moment in the spotlight. In January 1953, before the Zodiac had even gone on sale, Maurice Gatsonides, the Dutch racing driver, took a mildly modified Zephyr 6 to outright victory in the Monte Carlo Rally, pushing a Jaguar Mark 7 into second place. Ford of Britain had beaten Jaguar in a rally with a family saloon. The motor press took notice. Section 2, Three Graces, the Mark II and the Rise of Respectability, 1956 to 1962. By 1956, Ford of Britain was ready to move things on. In April of that year, the revised Mark II Consul, Zephyr, and Zodiac went on sale, a trio that the motoring press rather elegantly nicknamed the Three Graces. The changes were more than cosmetic. On the six-cylinder cars, the engine grew to 2 to 1,000, 5 to 153 cubic centimeters. Power on the Zodiac rose to 86 brake horsepower. The wheelbase was increased by 3 inches to 107 inches, and the overall width grew to 69 inches. Ford also improved the weight distribution and the turning circle. Top speed climbed to 88 miles per hour. A car, tested by the Motor magazine in 1956, recorded a top speed of 87.9 miles per hour and a 0 to 60 time of 17.1 seconds, a genuine improvement on the Mark I. In real-world terms, from 1956, customers could also specify a Borg-Warner automatic transmission, one of the first times a British Ford had offered this option. The gear lever sat on the steering column, in the American fashion, giving the front bench seat that broad, sofa-like quality that many buyers of the period actually preferred. The Mark II Zodiac was also distinguishable from the lesser Zephyr by details that matter to anyone who knows these cars. More elaborate tail-end styling, a different grille, gold-plated badges, two-tone paint and white-wall tires, retained as standard. The Zephyr, by contrast, carried single-tone paint and leather cloth trim. If you could afford the Zodiac, you made sure everyone could see that you could afford the Zodiac. The competition record continued to burnish the range's reputation. The Zephyr was one of the first cars to compete in the British Touring Car Championship, which held its inaugural round in 1958. Between 1958 and 1962, Zephyr drivers took 10 class wins. In 1959, Jeff Uren became the British Touring Car Championship Drivers' Champion, having guided his Zephyr to 6 class victories that season. For a large executive saloon, competing against smaller, nimbler machinery, that was a remarkable performance. The Mark II also gave rise to a convertible body, the two-door drophead, built by Car Buddies of Coventry, which remains among the most elegant body styles ever to wear a Ford badge. Estate car conversions were produced by Abbott of Farnham. These were not afterthoughts. They were proper variants, properly built. Section 3, the finest of the line, the Mark III and the Z-Cars years, 1962 to 1966. In April 1962, Ford of Britain launched the Mark III range, and for many enthusiasts, this is where the Zodiac story reaches its peak. The Mark III was a considerably more ambitious car than its predecessors. Where the Mark I and Mark II had shared body panels between Zephyr and Zodiac, the new generation used distinct bodies for the Zodiac compared to the lower-spec Zephyrs. The Zodiac was now genuinely its own car. It was larger, more imposing, and more completely equipped. With a wheelbase of 107 inches, it was a full 6-seater saloon with a boot that Ford's advertisements did not hesitate to describe as among the largest in its class. The design was the work of Canadian stylist Roy Brown, the same man who had been responsible for the ill-fated Ford Edsel in America. Brown arrived in Britain with something of a reputation to rebuild. He rebuilt it. The Zodiac, with its angular rear fins, its broad chrome horizontal strips, and its 4 headlamp front end, looked authoritative without being extravagant. Period road testers consistently praised the combination of a smooth ride and confident cornering. Front disc brakes were now standard on the Zodiac, a significant safety advance that many of its British competitors were still only offering as an option. Power output on the Zodiac's 2 to 1,000, 5 to 153 cubic centimeter straight 6 was 106 brake horsepower. A 4-speed gearbox replaced the old 3-speed unit, and an overdrive remained optional, alongside the Borg-Warner automatic. The Mark III range sold remarkably well. According to Haggerty's valuation records, a total of 77,709 Zodiacs were sold during the Mark III production run. The Zephyr 4 accounted for 106,810 examples, and the Zephyr 6 contributed 107,380 more. The Zodiac was the most expensive of the three, priced at £1,070, including purchase tax. For context, the average British worker in 1964 earned somewhere in the region of £1,000 per year. And then there was television. In January 1962, by extraordinary coincidence, almost exactly the moment the Mark III went on sale, the BBC launched Z-Cars. For 16 years and 801 episodes, this program placed the Ford Zephyr at the center of British cultural life as the patrol car of a fictional northern police force. Here is a detail worth knowing if you want to win an argument at the next Owners' Club meeting. The Zodiac was never used by the British police in the way the Zephyr was. The Zephyr was the standard traffic patrol car. The Zodiac was aimed at the executive buyer, not the constabulary. But the association between the Z-Car name and the whole Ford range Zephyr, Zodiac, and all became part of the national consciousness. It was arguably the most effective piece of product placement in British television history, and Ford did not pay a penny for it. Many enthusiasts believe Ford made a serious error by discontinuing the Mark III in January 1966. The car was still selling well. It was still well regarded. The decision was made to clear the way for the all-new Mark IV, and as we are about to see, the transition did not go smoothly. Section 4. The Aircraft Carrier, the Mark IV, and the Final Chapter, 1966 to 1972. When Ford revealed the Mark IV Zephyr and Zodiac range in April 1966, the reaction was mixed and, in some quarters, deeply unflattering. The new car was American in its proportions in a way that earlier Zodiacs had only gestured at. The bonnet was very long, the boot was short, the overall silhouette was slab-sided and imposing. British motoring writers, never short of a colourful phrase, promptly christened it the aircraft carrier. It was not intended as a compliment, though some buyers took it as one. Mechanically, the Mark IV represented a genuine step forward on paper. The Zodiac received an all-new 3-liter Essex V6 engine, displacing 2 to 1,000, 9 to 194 cubic centimeters, and producing 136 brake horsepower. There were all-round disc brakes, making the Zodiac one of the first medium-priced cars in Britain to offer this feature at the rear as well as the front. The rear suspension was now fully independent, replacing the live rear axle of all previous generations. Power steering was fitted as standard from September 1967. A floor-mounted 4-speed gearbox or a 3-speed Borg-Warner automatic were both available. According to a test published by Autocar magazine in 1967, the automatic version of the Zodiac could reach 100 miles per hour and accelerated from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 13.1 seconds. For a large 6-seater saloon of that period, those numbers were genuinely competitive. The executive trim level sat above the standard Zodiac and offered a level of equipment that genuinely challenged the established British luxury car hierarchy. Walnut dashboard facing, a tilting sunroof, fully reclining front seats, deep pile carpeting, and all the power steering and electric convenience equipment that the period could supply. In gold, these cars looked magnificent. They still do. But the Mark IV had problems, and they were problems that Ford struggled to fully resolve. The independent rear suspension, designed in haste as development had been rushed, was notoriously wayward at the handling limit. Early cars fitted with cross-ply tires were particularly susceptible to unsettling behavior at speed. The spare wheel was stowed under the bonnet at an angle ahead of the engine, a bizarre arrangement that made the front end heavier than it needed to be, and complicated routine maintenance. Car magazine, in its August 1966 assessment, suggested the new Zephyr would suit buyers who wanted a large, impressive-looking car at a moderate price and noted its likely appeal to the taxi trade. That was not the verdict Ford had been hoping for. Radial ply tires were standardized on V6, powered cars from September 1967, which brought a significant improvement in handling behavior. But the Mark IV's reputation was already set. There was one further curiosity about the Mark IV that deserves a mention. In 1971, Ford produced a special edition called the Zephyr Special, 1,000 examples, all finished in a color officially named uranium blue, with a white vinyl roof and revised interior specification. It was an attempt to generate some late-life interest in the range. Whether it succeeded is a matter of opinion. Production ended in 1972. According to Brightwell's, just 48,846 Mark IV Zodiacs had been built during the model's 6 years on sale. The entire Mark IV, Zephyr, and Zodiac range combined accounted for approximately 150,000 units. The car was replaced, without ceremony, by the Ford Consul and Granada, a new range developed jointly between Ford of Britain and Ford of Germany, marking the end of a purely British Ford flagship for good. Section 5. Why Britain Forgot, and Why That Is a Shame. So here is the question that the title of this video poses. Over almost 20 years, the Zodiac was the most completely equipped car that Ford of Britain had ever made. It pioneered technology: McPherson strut suspension, standard front disc brakes, independent rear suspension, all-round discs that would filter down through the entire Ford range and eventually become industry standard. It won rallies, it won races, and it furnished the backdrop to one of the most watched television programs in BBC history. And yet, today, a well-preserved Zodiac can still be bought for a fraction of the price of a comparable Jaguar Mark II or an MG from the same period. The Mark IV Zodiacs in particular remain extraordinarily undervalued for what they are: large, luxurious, mechanically interesting cars with genuine period character. Part of the reason for the Zodiac's obscurity is simply the passage of time. These were working cars, owned by people who drove them hard and replaced them regularly. The survival rate is low. Rust, which the monocoque bodies of the period were vulnerable to behind the spring hangers, at the sills, and in the floor areas, claimed the majority. Very few examples reached a sympathetic second owner while they were still worth preserving. Part of the reason is also the shadow cast by the Mark IV. When a car's final generation disappoints, that disappointment tends to color the public memory of everything that preceded it, even when that preceding history is one of genuine achievement. The Mark III Zodiac, in particular, deserved better than to be remembered primarily as the thing the Mark IV replaced. And part of the reason, frankly, is British class consciousness. The Zodiac was a Ford. It was bought by aspirational buyers who wanted executive motoring at a Ford price, and there was always a strain of British snobbery that considered that combination slightly contradictory. Jaguar buyers looked down on Zodiac buyers. Zodiac buyers looked across at Jaguar buyers and wished they were them. The Zodiac occupied an uncomfortable social space that neither the cheap end nor the expensive end of the market fully claimed as their own. Which is, of course, precisely what makes it interesting. The Ford Zodiac ran for 19 years, 4 generations, 4 distinct characters. And across the entire Zephyr and Zodiac family, more than 500,000 cars found homes in British driveways, police garages, company car parks, and export markets from Australia to South Africa to New Zealand. It was the first truly modern Ford that a British buyer could aspire to own. It introduced suspension technology that the whole industry would eventually adopt. It raced and rallied with genuine distinction. It sat in the title sequence of the most watched police drama on British television. And in its executive form, it offered wood trim, sunroof, and leather seating at a price that put comparable luxury genuinely within reach of ordinary professional families for the first time. That is not a small legacy. In fact, for a car that most people have forgotten, it is a rather large one. Now I want to hear from you. Did you, or someone in your family, own a Zodiac? Do you remember seeing one on the road? Perhaps you have a story about the Mark IV's handling, or a memory of the Raymond Mays conversion that a neighbor fitted to his Mark II. Whatever your connection to these cars, I would love to read about it in the comments below. This audience knows these vehicles in a way that no amount of research can fully replicate. And your experiences are part of this story too. If you found value in this video, please do take a moment to give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who share your interest in the cars that shaped the post-war decades. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is the moment. There is much more of this history still to cover. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering the cars that deserve to be remembered.